Hi, this is Tamara from MooglyBlog.com, and in this video, I'm talking about Yarnspirations' lovely new yarn, Bernat Blanket Breezy. As you can see, this is a gorgeous cake yarn with lots of texture, and it comes in 10 beautiful colorways. It's great for home decor and for knitting and crochet. So let's take a closer look at this yarn together. As you can see, this yarn comes wound in a cake, and it has some great striping that you can see right in the cake itself. It also has that texture I was talking about. You can see it's fuzzy, and it's worked onto sort of like a little string there that holds it all together. So this is not a plied or wound yarn. It's a little different, but it's a lot of fun to work with. Okay, so here's the label from the Hint of Mint colorway that you can see right here. As you can see, there is a dye lot, so you'll want to make sure to get enough for your project before you begin. It is a 4 or medium weight yarn with a recommended needle size of US 8 5mm and a hook size of US H 8 5mm as well. One of the things I love about this yarn is that it is machine washable and dryable, 100% polyester, so very easy care. And that's important because this is one your family is going to want to cuddle up with a lot. You can see there are 8.8 ounces in each cake, or a very generous 530 yards. If we crack open the label here, let's go ahead and rip it open and see what's inside. We have a crochet pattern included for free with the skein of yarn, and the instructions are both in English and in French. Now with cake yarns, you can pull from the inside or the outside, and if you're adding a new skein to an already going project, you can choose that based on matching up your different stripes. However, I really like to pull from the inside on these when I can, and you just want to take your time to really try and find the very center of that skein. You're going to end up pulling out just a little bit probably. Rarely get lucky enough to find that very first end on the first go, but you can just pull out that little bit and separate it until you find your end and then start crocheting or knitting. Sometimes I have better luck. This time I got just a little bit more, but it's not too bad. And as long as you're careful with it, it doesn't tangle up too badly at all. Now that we've pulled up a strand here, we can take a closer look at the strand itself. As you can see here, there's that string with the little bits of fuzz attached right to that string. So it's going to have a lot of really great texture. And it's labeled a thick and thin yarn, but I have found it to be relatively consistent. The thickness and thinness isn't overly dramatic and not something that I think affects the look of the project that you make with this too much. That said, with a fuzzy yarn like this, you're not going to get a whole lot of stitch definition, just a lot of coziness. So let's take a look at how it works up in both knit and crochet. Okay, so here's a small swatch that I've been working up in knit, and this is all garter stitch. As you can see, there's just not really any stitch definition here, but there is a whole lot of squish and loveliness. I did find that it was relatively easy to knit with. In fact, it may be easier to knit with because you can see each one of those loops on your needle individually. And as you can imagine, it's hard to see into those individual stitches in crochet. We'll see that here in just a moment. But for knitting, at least, you can pull apart those individual loops and really get into those quite nicely. Now, because it's 100% polyester and it's not a plied yarn, there isn't a whole lot of stretch to the yarn itself. In fact, I'd say there's none at all. So that could make it a little bit more difficult if you're used to working with yarns that have more stretch. But if you just take your time, I find that this one is really lovely to knit, and it really does create such a beautifully squishy fabric. And here's a swatch that I worked up in crochet. I did a few rows of double crochet here and then a couple rows of half double crochet. And then I tried working a few bobbles just to see how well those would show up. And as you can see, they're definitely subtle. So I think to get patterns in this yarn, to create a little bit more stitch interest, if you don't want just sort of a, nice standard flat work here, you could do something like bobbles. These were, I believe, 5-stitch bobbles, so bigger ones, even to get this little effect. It's going to create a subtle effect. But the other thing you'll want to do is work with your negative space, which is something I've done in a pattern I've designed with this yarn that I'll show you here in a moment. But I'll just take a couple stitches here to show you. When you're working with this yarn, like I say, it can be really difficult to see those individual stitches. So you almost kind of have to just know where that stitch should be. So possibly for more experienced crocheters, and then you can just use your needle, or your hook rather, to guide you as you go into those stitches. Like I know there's one here, there should be one right about here, and I can just sort of feel with my hook where that's supposed to go, but I'm not actually able to see those individual stitches. Working it along with a more smooth yarn held together might help with that, but certainly if you just take your time, you can work with this one as well for crochet. Additionally, working with a slightly larger hook makes those stitches a little bit easier to see too, so that's another option. I'll finish up this stitch here, and then let's go ahead and pull it out so we can see it does frog really well. You'll just want to go ahead and take your time. Any textured yarn like this, I don't want to pull too fast. I like to pull a little slower so that it doesn't actually snap the yarn or anything, but it really does frog quite well, so you can not worry too much about making mistakes or trying different stitches with it. So here is the calming, breezy crochet throw that I designed for Yarnspirations using Bernat Blanket Breezy, specifically 3 balls of the High Seas colorway. I did go up to a US eye hook that I found was a little easier to see my stitches for, but you can see here that in order to create a pattern with this yarn, I used the negative space, basically creating almost like a lace pattern so that you could see the pattern in the yarn itself. Nonetheless, this is an extremely lightweight yarn, whether you work it up in a solid swatch or, something more airy and lacy like this. It is just incredibly light, although obviously very, very warm with all this fuzz. It does have great squish, both in the skein, you can see here, it's got a tremendous amount of squish, and in the finished project. It really does feel beautiful in the hand. Now, I didn't come across any knots when I was working with this yarn, or any lumpy or weird tied bits, and it's already fuzzy, so you don't have to worry about it fuzzing up with use. I mentioned before there is a dye lot, but it works great for knitters and crocheters. As for beginners, I think this yarn would be a little bit more difficult to use because you cannot see those individual stitches to work into, but if you've got a little bit of crochet or knitting experience, it isn't too hard to work with at all. Just make sure you've got some good lighting, relatively simple stitches, and I always recommend that you use stitch markers, particularly with yarns where you have trouble seeing those individual stitches. If you use a stitch marker on the first and last stitch of every row, it will help you keep those sides a little bit more consistent and make it less likely that you'll skip a stitch. So I hope you'll give Yarnspirations Bernat Blanket Breezy a try. It's a really fun yarn to use with lots of texture, and it just feels really wonderful while you're working it up and in your finished project. Thanks so much for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe.